This is how strategic forecasting allows you to work. So let me stop and ask questions. I ran over my time, I think. Sir.
Thank you, Mr. Friedman, for a excellent lecture. My name is Rob Gavazov. I'm just on the second meal. I started to become a lawyer. I know it's kind of, well, for a lawyer, it's kind of dangerous to talk about politics, but, well, I love politics. So you mentioned about broadcasting the conflicts, and, well, there is a really interesting book on, well, it's not written by Tom Clancy himself, one of my favorite authors, but it's written under his license. It's called Tom Clancy's Envoy. According to the story, well, you mentioned keywords like Europe, GDP, and, well, warfare. And the thing is, according to the book, the European Union became fully independent. It had its own military, and they created the European Federation. And, well, they became this new superpower with new technology, high GDP and population in the US. Do you really believe that it can happen in this situation, and will it be some sort of an opponent for the US? Thank you.
If I understood you correctly, and I'm a little deaf, I think, you're asking the question of, could Europe have a united military?
Yeah, and even stronger than the US.
It could if the French and the Germans trusted each other. If the Italians wanted to raise an army. So what the problem is, there is a common understanding that everybody wants to be rich. This is the foundation of Europe. If I join the European Union, I'm going to be rich like Germany. The reality is that they're not rich. Now, the idea that having the basic reason for creating a European Union expand to a military under the same general command as Germany has, but I mean, Germany doesn't want a military. Germany is very happy with the situation it has. So the answer is, if they could form a united entity, they would, yes, and it would be powerful as the United States. The weakness of the entire problem is these are separate nations with centuries of fear and hatred of each other. They don't trust each other, with good reason. And it's very difficult to imagine anybody but the United States being under the command of these forces. The only reason the United States could do that is we had more troops and bombs and everything, but also we didn't want anything from them. We wanted them to do their fighting. We didn't intend to take anything. The Germans want something from the Italians. The Spaniards want something from the Germans, so it becomes more complicated. Did I see your hand?
Sir, thank you for the lecture. In your geopolitics series, you claimed that the natural western border of Russia should be the Carpathian Mountains, if I'm correct. Do you think we'll eventually be able to reach it, or do you stick to your prognosis, to your forecast made in your book, The World in the 21st Century, where you have said that we will be torn apart by 2020? And that is the first question, and the second one is...
But that's more than enough. Let me try that one.
I just wanted to ask how to create a Russian STRATFOR as powerful as your organization. Thank you.
I didn't know I was powerful. Thank you. Look, the natural boundary that would protect Russian interests would be the Carpathians. But the problem is that the North European plain is undefended and indefensible. So even if they reach there, they're vulnerable in the north, Russia's north. I am very pessimistic about the future of Russia, not because I'm anti-Russian. Russia depends, President Putin's strategy was to build Russia on the revenue of natural resource sales. That was a good strategy. It didn't happen. You are dependent on the worst sort of product. First, you're dependent for your customers buying your stuff. And secondly, you are dependent on a product in which technology is revolutionizing availability. Temporarily, the problem is that China is not growing as fast as they thought. The BRIC countries are slowing down. Europe is in near recession. So naturally, the price will go down eventually. But that's a cyclical problem. The structural problem is something that was not anticipated. It was technological, which was that in Texas, they would invent ways to get at oil that didn't exist before. And everybody said, this is wonderful. What they didn't anticipate was that between recession and the technology, prices would plunge. Russian national economy depends on the price of oil. And if they can't get that price, and if the quantity absorbed declines, if they have competition from markets, then you wind up in a very difficult situation for Russia. And the problem that I argued was that the fundamental weakness of the Soviet Union, which was an internal incoherence of economies, continues in the Russian Federation. And particularly because I saw Russia rising, I saw all sorts of international forces coming down on Russia, the sanctions being very mild beginning. So Russia rising threatens many interests. Its economy has not developed as expected. Technology has perhaps permanently started to depress the price of oil. There aren't many. How does it hold together? How does this entity hold together at this point? And between the international pressures that Russia must bring upon itself as it pursues its national interests, like its interests in Ukraine, which are real and genuine, and the economic situation, it's very difficult to see. Not that it will necessarily break apart, but it has an inherent downside that is built into the system that creates structures that are difficult to predict. So I continue with the argument. I made the argument that Ukraine in 2015, I missed by a year, would become a major battleground. And then I argued out of that the Russian Federation would have a great deal of difficulty. There are parts of it that will do very well, parts of it that won't, but you can't live with a map like this. Sir?
So I would like to shift the focus of our discussion for a while. From very important.
Could you speak up, please?
I would like to shift the focus of our discussion for a while from really important geopolitical stuff.
Could you please speak up?
So I've got very I've got a very personal question. So, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, I'm married.
Personal question. Answering that question, I can understand. So, first, I would like to recall that George Kennan, the founding father of the famous strategy, the first director of the policy planning staff, and one of the greatest strategists of the 20th century, in his article, in his ex-article published according to various sources of the Soviet conduct, referred to a novel by Thomas Mann, the brothers, who visualized his ideas about the Soviet future, etc. So, my question is whether you have a set of authors, writers, or philosophers whose writings have enormously and profoundly impacted your analytical skills, the lenses through which you perceive reality, and your mindset.
Well, before I got an honest job, I was a professor of political philosophy. So, well, I mean, I was getting to that, and the one that I loved to teach the most was Thucydides. Because if you read Thucydides, where he describes the difference between Athens, the maritime city, and Sparta, the inland city, and the strength of the Spartan soldiers and the cleverness of the Athenians, I mean, this was the beginning of all geopolitics. Now, there are many after him that, I learned from. Hegel was one. Because when he spoke about the real being rational and the rational real, it sounds crazy. And you realize that he's saying, look, there is a logic and a necessity to the human condition. Humans did not simply lurch upward to this point. There was necessity there. So, I mean, the two poles that influenced me the most, I dedicated, my motto in the next 100 years was from Hegel. and Thucydides was the other one. And they really are, you know, it was, had I not taught political philosophy, I don't think I could have developed this theory, if it's any good, without it. So yes, I do have to.
Friedman, thank you very much for your lecture. How do you think the current shale gas revolution in the United States will change its political and economic positions in the Western Hemisphere? Thank you.
The United States, given an option, is an isolationist power. For the 20th century, except for the periods that intervened in the First World War, Second World War, and the extended involvement in the Cold War, because the Soviet strategy was wars of national liberation in Vietnam and other places, we were constantly trying to counter that. If we look at that, yeah, we see that the United States really is not a country that has an enormous interest in Eurasia, except that Eurasia not unite. If we have an option, the United States, precisely because we are now, North America is now at a point of essential energy independence. And you really have to think of Mexico and Canada and NAFTA as a single integrated entity because that's how it behaves. Therefore, the desire in the United States is disengagement. It's very difficult to do because we also want to have successful outcomes to conflicts and we want to disengage. And so the United States is caught in its immaturity between two needs. But I think what it really does, it means our dependence on Saudi Arabia is no longer there. We can talk to Iran and not care what Saudi Arabia thinks. It means that our relationship to Israel can be more distant than it was. The entire Middle East becomes far less important to us. So the problem is, how do we get out of the Middle East? This is what President Obama is trying to cope with, and if George W. Bush had been president, he'd be coping with the same problem. How can he disengage without that? The one thing we can't disengage from is a rising Russia, because it is too powerful to ignore, but weak enough that it can be dealt with now cheaply. And that's the problem. Never scare the United States while you're still weak.
Thank you very much for the lecture. My question is, can you describe current geopolitical situation as a second Cold War, or just simply tension in relations between the US and the Russian Federation?
The Cold War had two dimensions to it. One was a nuclear standoff, which must not be belittled. And the second, that because of containment, the Soviet Union created brilliant strategy of alliances to the rear of containment and wars of national liberation. Okay? Didn't matter who, they would fund. This was a very different war. We still have, and this is not a trivial danger, I mean, the fact that Russia has a trump card in its nuclear weapons can never be ignored. I mean, there's a limit to how far we can push Russia. And what a forecast that I just said, you know, is frightening when you think about Russia desperate. So you can't make Russia too desperate. I'm not even sure this will turn into a war. This will be a kind of unpleasant grinding against each other, I think, you know, for an extended period of time. Neither side wants war. So I think it's very misleading when people say second Cold War. It's not even a Cold War. It is a divergence of interests that are hard to define. But the Cold War, I was there. It was different.
What is the role of Commonwealth of Nations and its soft power in the modern international relations? And does its soft power pose threat to U.S. global domination?
Soft power is what people who have no hard power claim is going to be very effective. No, I mean, the Europeans developed this myth of soft power because they didn't want to have a defense budget. And yeah, well, they were very rich. They could give people money, and the people would take the money. But when they became poor, they laughed at the Europeans. So, I mean, soft power has certain advantage. You know, if the United States is liked, there's a certain advantage. If we're not liked, we're going to do the same thing. So, I think we have to be very careful when we talk about power to be very clear on what it means. It means coercion, that you can coerce somebody, that you can use money or whatever. Soft power means that they really like you and they want to do what you want to do. This is like going to a nightclub and the girls really like you until they find out you don't have any money. That's soft power. No, I'm not her. I like her better than you.
Thank you so much, first, for the joy. Well, my question may seem a little dumb, but if Hillary becomes president, because she is bad, as we know, how would the politics toward Russia change? That's the first. And secondly, how would the immigration policy change?
First, I want you to take a look at Obama. What he came to power wanting to do, and how little his presidency differed from George W. Bush's. To understand that a president is not that powerful in the United States, and that he's trapped in reality. I mean, first, the founders created a system. He is not the government of the United States. He's 1/3 of the government, and mostly not the most important. In foreign policy, he has more power. So when you ask the question what Hillary would do about it, who cares what Hillary would do about it? What will Congress do about it?
Well, President Obama, you know, there's such a thing as the executive power, right?
You can use that executive power when the last election is over that you have to be running in, and you don't care what happens. In other words, Hillary, you can't use that when you take office, because you will never get anything else through Congress. I'm not sure that the Supreme Court will let him do this anyway, because there's a third branch of government that's there. But the point I'm making is, many people, particularly in this region, vastly overestimate the American president as if he's godlike. Obama never thought he would have this presidency. He didn't want this presidency. He wanted to do he wanted Merkel to like him. Merkel doesn't like anybody, but he thought that she would like him. He wanted to get out of the Middle East. He made a speech in Cairo where he thought everybody wouldn't love, and it turned out they didn't. When you look back in his presidency, it was a continuation of the Bush presidency. Why? Because Bush didn't pick the path. When he took office, the last thing he thought he would do was invade Afghanistan. You know, if you said to him, Mr. President, do you realize in a year you're going to be invading Afghanistan? What are your plans? There were no plans. He never expected 9/11. 9/11 happened because Bill Clinton did not take al-Qaeda seriously enough, did not conduct a vigorous war. And Bill Clinton got that job because Bush decided to go to Saudi Arabia, which shared. So each president inherits the problem that the other president has. And each believes that, and campaigns saying, you know, that I am going to be everything you want me to be. And then he becomes an American president. So if you follow what I'm saying, the personality of your leaders is not that important. I said if Putin hadn't been the one to take power, an other member of the FSB would have emerged. This was not what you wanted, not what they wanted, it was what was going to happen. So Hillary will do almost exactly the same thing as the Republican candidate, but she will make very different speeches. And that is the point that I'm making, and the truth. It doesn't matter. I never vote in elections. The only time my vote counts is if it's a tie. It's never a tie. I stay home, drink beer, and watch television.
Thank you, Mr. Friedman, for your speech and for your book, next 100 years too. My question is about the international organizations, yeah, especially the UN, what do you see will be the role of the UN in the 21st century? Because in your book, it was, if I'm not mistaken, international organizations were not mentioned, and I just wonder what would be the role of the UN.
None? No. Here's where the UN becomes useful. When all of the leading powers in the Security Council want something, peacekeepers, some other non-controversial thing, the United Nations becomes very useful because it becomes an instrument that no one nation has to be involved. So when we look at, for example, the Yugoslavian Civil War and its end, where everybody, except the Russians, when even the Russians bought in, wanted a certain outcome, it was good. During the Cold War, the United Nations had very little use because the distinction between the Soviets and the Americans was so deep that it was paralyzed as an organization. I don't know that it'll be paralyzed. It still has its uses, but it's not a decisive force in preventing war. And so the argument is, my argument would be that it has a useful function, but a limited one, and certainly no power. I have to go here, I think.
Thank you for your speech. My question is, you were talking about controlling unknown variables and controlling, so basically that we can predict everything. Don't you give any chance to, any percentage to chance or luck, or is it important in analytical work? And another more real question is, actually we are all human beings and we can't be rational to 100%, so how many analysts do you need to, I don't know, analyze a more or less simple international situation, like, for example, in the Middle East or what's happening in Ukraine, and what do you need to have, what qualities?
There are any number of accidents that can happen to a human being. You're on your way to being the next Einstein, you walk out and you get hit by a car. You're not going to be the next Einstein. In nations of 300 million or 100 million people, it's more difficult to have the car hitting, okay? It's not that people are rational in the sense that they fully understand where they're going. They're just very good at the job they do. So the presidents are very good at becoming effective as presidents. And in that sense, there's a certain level of random choice. What is our policy toward Argentina, the United States? I don't think we have a policy, but if we did, it would be an accident. So surely there are many, many things that are accidental. But can the fundamental course of vast institutions simply be an accident? It's hard to do because there are so many balancing and counterbalancing powers. Countries don't survive for 200 years, 300 years, 500 years. There can be miscalculations, in a sense, about Napoleon invading Russia. But in the end, it didn't matter because Russia did what it had to do, even if it miscalculated, and defeated them. So sure, there are many levels under which accidents could happen, right? But in the same way that a recession, we're very comfortable in economics saying a recession is going to happen, and then not saying, well, Obama wanted a recession. It had nothing to do with what Obama wanted or Putin wanted or anything else. Economic cycles are not in people's control. If you're head of a corporation and you say, I'm going to invest all of my money in Chinese stocks. I don't care any longer about the business I'm in making cars, I'm going to invest. The system would not permit you. It would stop you. And you can't do just anything, because as a head of a corporation, you have to deal with the market, the prices, and these are all realistic things. And if you're not good at that, you're removed. We're very comfortable in economics at thinking of unplanned events, recessions, unintended events. We're very good at thinking in terms of a corporate head being forced to be rational. But somehow when we get to politics, we disengage from the obvious notions of, rationality, and we assume that it is a whim. I think this goes back to the monarchies, where the idea that the king somehow had a wisdom, and he could have visions or whatever he willed would happen. Well, read Machiavelli's Prince. So I would argue to you that there is accident, there is probability, businesses fail, but usually not because the president is stupid. The CEO usually has made decisions and they were going to fail anyway. But if you take seriously the idea of corporate rationality, and you take seriously the idea of unintended consequences, then you need to move to the idea that this could apply to political life as well.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I was really interested in how Americans see their future, because all the evening we were speaking about Russian future and how we see ourselves. But you, as an American citizen, what can you say and tell us about how you see the future of your own country?
I don't look at it as most Americans. Most Americans feel that everything is terrible, the world is collapsing. But we have, ever since I was young, in the Vietnam War and the Depression before I was born, and we're the most depressive nation in the world politically and the most optimistic nation personally. So if you ask the person, what do you think your children are going to be? They're going to be great. Okay? If you ask him, what do you think the political future is now, he says, it's just terrible. There's no hope. This Obama's an idiot. Or George Bush is an idiot.
No, but what about the real things that you can analyze yourself?
From my point of view, the United States is the overwhelming center of gravity of the international system. Whether it's liked or not, whether it is admired or not, it is a quarter of the world's economy. As I said, it controls the oceans. It also is a place that has one terrific advantage that we never talk about. It is very good at managing immigrants. So Germany, Europe is struggling with the idea of the Islamic immigrants. We're also struggling with the idea of Mexican immigrants. How could we build a wall but make sure they get through? In other words, we know we need them. We've just integrated Indians and Chinese in huge numbers to the point where the Indians are the wealthiest ethnic group in the United States in 30 years. In a world of declining population, the ability to absorb efficiently large numbers of immigrants is a tremendous advantage to the United States. When we look at that, plus the fact that American culture, in the name of computers, has redefined the entire world. And if you want to program, you're going to program in English. In other words, the cultural imperialism of the United States. It's just an overwhelming force. We are in the position, really, of Britain at least, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And it hasn't even begun to unfold. I say this not as a patriot, or I am one, but I hope I could also, I see the weaknesses. Race relations is still, bad, but underneath it all, the United States doesn't face the kind of challenges other countries face and can project power tremendously. It is not necessarily liked. So you ask a question of people, what country do you least like frequently in the United States? Which country would you most like to live in except that you're your own? The United States. So this is a paradox. But subjective interpretations are not what I'm looking at. I mean, how does a country with that high a GDP it takes a long time for anybody to overcome that.
What do you think about WikiLeaks and the analysis of work?
I hate it. What, are you kidding me? I think WikiLeaks' method of work is it has a website. And if somebody else steals something, they'll put it on there. Julian Assange is now a genius. So the people that are interesting are not WikiLeaks. The people who are interesting are the people who, Manning, for example, Snowden. I mean, these are interesting people. And, there's an interesting question. Did it hurt the United States to have these things revealed? And the answer is interesting because it didn't. For everything Snowden revealed, we're still doing it. And by the way, everybody knew we were doing it because they were helping us. Secondly, for all the information that was revealed on the State Department, it showed me that the diplomats are not as stupid as they sounded when I met them. As to what they did to us, evil, terrible people. No, the point is, I didn't like it. It was an extremely unpleasant experience, but I'm here. And now that even Sony had its emails stolen, I feel much better. Pick him. He wins.
Do you think that sheerly publishing this book made your predictions, and if it's read by, say, a president of Russia who has seen unfavorably with conditions in your book, if they actually dedicated a lot of work to try to reverse what you claim is going to happen, do you think they could actually overcome these barriers you mentioned?
Well, firstly, political leaders don't read books. They're too busy. Secondly, they won't read my book, certainly. And thirdly, they wouldn't believe it. To become a Putin or an Obama, you have to have a belief in yourself and your own power. You may not have this power, but you have to believe in it. All right? So if I were to say to either of these people, your country's in trouble and will decline, they will immediately assume that it's either nonsense or not under me it can't. To become a leader of a country of millions, you have to have an enormous ego. Not to the point of irrationality, but if you don't have a self-confidence, subjectively, you can't become a leader. No one ever became a leader without a huge ego. And therefore, when a seedy little guy like me writes a book and it predicts something, it's discounted. So this is why I don't think the Heisenberg effect governs here. Sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Andrew Kirkville, and I'm a master's student here at MGIMO. I also work at Friedman News Agency. I'd like to ask for a short forecast about something, actually. What do you think? Do you think that the emerging Russian-Turkish partnership can be just as important, if not more so, than the Russian-German partnership? And what does this portend for the Western Balkans? For example, can we see the return of trilateral competition there, but with the EU replacing Austria-Hungary? Thank you.
Well, the answer that I would give is, who said it's an emerging relationship? I mean, it remains to be seen.
Well, I mean, in terms of the new energy pipeline, the new South Stream.
Okay, everybody take a breath. Energy is like milk. You have to have it, but the place is swimming in it. There was a period 5 years ago where pipeline politics defined geopolitics. Today, it doesn't. It doesn't because of the new geometry of energy, which is still unfolding. Russia suspended South Stream. This hurt Bulgaria terribly. But it really doesn't change the game. If Turkey becomes a hub for Russian oil, this will be of great benefit to Russia. And Turkey, which is a very seriously rising power, okay, will not change its policy in the Balkans one bit because of that. So I don't see this as a constraint at this point. If something dramatic would happen to take great amount of oil offline, you know, possibly. The Balkans, I mean, I think there will be a competition in the Balkans between Turkey, to some extent Russia, but not the EU, because there is no EU to compete. As Zbigniew Brzezinski said, when I want to call Moscow, I know how to call Moscow. When I want to call Tokyo, I know how to... What number do I dial for Europe? So the Germans may have interest in that direction, but they're far away from exercising them. I think a Balkan competition of serious... It would require the rise of Turkey to a level where Russia would have to respond, or the United States. And that would be, I mean, that's a hard place to compete, unless you have a pressing reason. So I would argue that pipeline politics don't simply drive anymore. That's why South Stream was canceled. I mean, the Russians just didn't see the point. And if it did, become an issue in the region, we're far away from that region becoming hot. They will kill themselves on their own. I mean, I don't believe for a second that the Balkan wars are over. I mean, I say this, regretfully, but the issues that were there have not been settled, and they weren't trivial.
As you said, whenever there was a rising power in Europe, the US would somewhat intervene to balance the situation. But nowadays, there's an enormous power rising in Asia, like China, and there's also quite a strong Russia. So, how do you forecast this? US strategy would be to try to deal with both such powers at the same time.
Well, firstly, in Asia, China is not as strong as it appears. Geographically, it can't move to the south because of jungles and hills. And when it tried to attack Vietnam in 1978, it lost. The Himalayas means that only in the newspapers can there be a competition, a war between India and China. To the north is Siberia, they're not crazy, and to the west is the steppes of Kazakhstan. The People's Liberation Army is a domestic domestic security force. It is not an effective power projection tool. If you take a look at the geography of the South China Sea and the East China Sea, they're both enclosed. They can be easily blocked in many ways. The Chinese very shortly may have their first aircraft carrier, but they have never had a fleet action. They are not a naval power. It's very easy to have one ship, but a carrier battle group is an aircraft carrier, an anti-aircraft cruiser, 2 anti-submarine destroyers, and 1 or 2 attack submarines, not counting all the support vessels. If you've ever seen these in action, it's like a ballet. The United States has been doing this since the 1930s. So we're very good at it. There's not a single Chinese admiral who has ever conducted combat with a carrier battle group. He's never even sailed with one. It takes a long time, and you're going to need at least 10 of those to take on the United States. The United States has absolutely no intention of invading China. China has no ability to take on the US Navy. There's no conflict. The only time you hear of conflict is when the US Navy's budget comes up. And then you will hear stories about the terrible Chinese Navy and how it will destroy us immediately. My son's in the Air Force, and he's in the Space Command. And we suddenly had a report about a Chinese anti-satellite taking out one of our satellites. So I called him and asked him, when are the budget hearings? He said, why? Just tell me when the budget hearings are. 3 weeks. So the greatest advocate of Chinese power is the US military. This is where their funding comes from. Therefore, we don't have to deal with China.
Thank you for an amazing lecture and very interesting answers. I'd like to ask the following. Is there any perspective for the greater Middle East concept?
I didn't hear you.
Is there any perspective for the greater Middle East concept?
Well, I mean, the only meaningful Middle East concept that I know of is the Caliphate. And that's a greater Middle East concept. From the basic reality of the Middle East, of the Islamic world, is deep divisions. Not just Arabs against Persians, Sunnis against Shiites, but deep regional hostilities, tribal hostilities that you see in Lebanon, Libya, I mean. So it's very difficult to imagine a caliphate emerging from this. If that were to emerge, that would change the entire dynamic of the global system. But I don't see how it can. I don't see who would lead it that would be trusted. There's a reason the Islamic world is as fragmented as it is. The only country that could create a greater Middle East is Turkey. Whenever there is a unified entity in the Middle East, it's Turkic. And so I would argue that watching Turkey, which I think is a rising power and a very important one, not quite ready to compete what you're talking about, but Turkey could create some sort of entity, but it's fighting against being drawn in. It doesn't want, it knows the price it has to pay. It's not ready to pay the price.
All right. Mr. Friedman, I have a question. It's a bit practical. So the Ukrainian elites say they want to join NATO. Some of the US officials say we want to see Ukraine in NATO. German foreign minister says we don't need Ukraine in NATO. So there's an obvious controversy within the Union. And Russia does everything it can to prevent this scenario. And the question is now obviously that Ukraine is not joining NATO at the moment. But how do you see the future of this problem? Is it possible in your mind?
Well, the real question is, what does it mean to join NATO? So, NATO is an organization that most of the members have no military power. NATO is essentially an organization which can legitimize American military action and occasionally, send some help here and there. But it is not a functioning military alliance. The United States finds it useful on rare occasion. They will all agree, and the United States can do something it wants and claim the legitimacy of NATO. Secondly, the United States may say that it wants Ukraine in NATO, but it's trying just to drive the Russians crazy. The United States does not want to see, it does not want to have a NATO-style commitment to Ukrainian territory. If it goes into conflict, it really doesn't want to fight deep into Ukraine. I mean, not if it does, it at least wants to retain its choice. Once Ukraine is a member of NATO, the United States loses that choice. Where an attack on one of us is an attack on all. The Germans will send 2 fighter planes and a tank. We send over 15 divisions. It doesn't work for us. So again, it's, you want to jerk the Russian tail. The Russians like jerking ours in Syria and places like that. That's what it feels like. We really have to understand each other. The Russians have to understand there are limits to what they can do, say, in the Middle East without exciting American interest. The United States has to realize that if you want to drive the Russians crazy and push them even farther in a direction you don't want them to go, just keep talking about NATO. But that's just noise. The reality is much deeper.
Boys and girls, can we have 2 last questions, please?
You pick them. Okay, I'll pick them. Who? You. There you go.
Thank you very much. My question is, will the withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan somehow reshape the international system?
Will somehow do what to the international system?
Will it reshape, will it change the international system? And will it change the Russian imperative as a nation? Because we will get a new threat in Central Asia. Thank you.
Well, you don't need a new threat in Central Asia to shape your behavior. You have plenty of threats in Asia that make you do the same thing. And mostly you can't cope with them as threats. I mean, it's difficult to you. I mean, Afghanistan is Afghanistan. Its basic threat is to Pakistan. And Pakistan basically has responsibility, with Iran also having some. It is not a matter of fundamental interest to the United States. We got in there to destabilize Al-Qaeda. That's succeeded. We didn't leave. Under Bush, there was very little military activity because it wasn't necessary. Obama made it a very active theater of operations as an alternative to Iraq. But in truth, the United States, I can't imagine a country where the United States has less interest than Afghanistan. But it's one of those things, you know, when you ask, can there be accidents? Yeah, I mean, sort of 9/11 triggered a series of accidents that didn't really change things fundamentally. Can it destabilize Central Asia? I mean, I don't think by itself it destabilizes Central Asia. Central Asia can destabilize itself very nicely. It has Tajikistan, after all. Yes? All right. I mean, pleading helps. You guys.
Thank you very much. Could you tell us, please, whether the problem of the Iranian nuclear program is going to...
Excuse me, say it louder.
Whether the problem of the Iranian nuclear program is going to be solved soon and may Iran become another U.S. regional ally soon?
To build a nuclear weapon, having refined uranium is not nearly enough. You have to have a reliable missile, and you have to have a weapon that can go up at 10 Gs, enter vacuum, have temperature swings of 300 plus to 300 minus degrees Fahrenheit, and then re-enter the atmosphere at 5,000 degrees. And then land in the middle of Tel Aviv and go off. Because if it lands in the middle of Tel Aviv and it doesn't go off and the tail says made in Iran, you have some serious problems in Iran. In other words, one of the truths is that the Iranians are far from having a nuclear weapon. And they've used the nuclear program they have, particularly enriched uranium, as a bargaining tool to shape its relationships with the United States as an offer to go away. Right now, both Iran and the United States have more serious problems in Iraq. Both of them want the Islamic State to be crushed. They're cooperating tactically with airstrikes and everything else. And so what would have been a major event 2 years ago, you know, the nuclear talks didn't reach anything. Basically, Kerry walked away and said, yeah, we'll come back to it in a few months. And the Iranians said, yeah, we'll be seeing you. In the meantime, the operations in Iraq went on. In other words, this was never the threat it appeared. We did not believe there would ever be airstrikes against it. They learned it from the Koreans, the North Koreans, how to make a lot of money out of a nuclear program. Because we kept paying them to not do it anymore until we got tired and said, God, do it. So understand that the United States has a well-known nuclear phobia. And nations have learned that you want to manipulate the United States. It's much better to have a nuclear program than a nuclear weapon. An effective nuclear weapon with a delivery system will have a very unpleasant consequence. A program that's very close, 2 weeks away from having enriched uranium is much better. How many times has it appeared that the Iranians were a year away for the past 5 years? So understanding what the Iranians are doing and why, understanding how the Americans respond, will give you the answer. And also a little technology. It's hard to build a nuclear weapon. Okay,
George,
thank you.
I will allow one more question from that side.
You pick it.
You pick it.
Assess the future of the responsibility to protect principle.
To protect it?
Responsibility to protect principle.
To protect principle? Excuse me?
What will be the future of the principle responsibility to protect?
The principle protect what?
Can we have a bit of explanation, please?
Please, could you? I really don't understand.
There's a principle that changed the responsibility to protect that appeared emerged in 2002 under the auspices of the Canadian government. And it was supposed to replace the principle of humanitarian intervention. So, what do you think will be the future of this principle?
Well, given the fact that I haven't even heard of it, and I should, I don't think this is a very powerful principle. No, Excuse me?
There was an article in the American Interest magazine in August 2013 about RTP principle.
I mean, you have a principle, people have to know of it. You can't just announce one.
George, if I may, it's a principle that says basically, if you want to invade another country, find an unhappy person there.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you.